Barbara, how are you?
Hi, just fine. How are you?
Are you ready for another tour of the historic area?
I am, and today I think we're going to stay outside
Oh,
because
good.
it's so pretty.
Oh,
But what I want to talk to you about today, we've done quite a good tour so far,
yes.
but I haven't found out how Frankfort got its name. Was it from Frankfort, Germany?
No, some people think that. As a matter of fact, back in 1780, there were quite a few men that were going towards Jefferson County. They wanted to go to Man's Lick there, and they camped on the present site of Frankfort. And during the night, they were attacked by the Indians. And Stephen Frank was killed, but his two partners, William Bryant, and the other one was a real nice young fella, they were wounded, but they escaped the Indians. And so, due to the fact that Stephen Frank was killed, and also the fact that there was a very fine ford down here at the end of this street that stretched over to Devil's Hollow, it became Frank's Ford originally. Then they changed it and it was contracted to Frankfort. So that's where it got its name, Barbara.
Well, I thought everything looks pretty much like a little bit like the scenery in Germany, and so I thought, well, maybe that's how it got it. Was any one person responsible for the settling of
Yes,
Frankfort?
there was one person in particular, I guess, that you say was responsible for the establishment of Frankfort, and that was General James Wilkinson. He had retired from the Army, and he came west to seek his fortune, and he came here in this area of Frankfort, and he bought about 600 acres of land from Humphrey Marshall, and he drained it, fixed it up real nice the best he could. At that time there was an older settlement called Leestown down by Ancient Age Distillery. But anyway, he drained it, and he had a definite plan for Frankfort in that he named the streets. For instance, he named this street right here, Wilkinson Street, which was the main residential street. The next street over, of course, was Washington Street, and he named that for his very good friend, General George Washington.
I didn't realize
The next
that.
street over was St. Clair, and that was named for another good friend of his, General Arthur St. Clair. As you can see, some of his old friends in the Continental Army, he named some of the streets. The next street over from St. Clair that was parallel to St. Clair was named Ann, and it was named for the beautiful and charming Ann Biddle Wilkinson, his wife. Now, the street that ran perpendicular to Ann there was named Montgomery, for General George Montgomery, who was another good friend of his. Now it is known, of course, as Main Street. And this street that you can see here, Wapping Street, was named by a friend of his by the name of Instone, who came over to build ships for General Wilkinson. He came over from London. But he named this street Wilkinson for a street that he lived on near the Thames there in London. Now, the next street down that parallels Main Street was named Market Street because that was where the market was in the early days. In back of that, in back of the old Capitol, which runs parallel to what's now Broadway, was named Clinton for General George Clinton, who was the first governor of New York and was later vice president of the United States. The next street parallel on down from Clinton Street is Miro, and it was named for General Miro. He spelled his name M-I-R-O, who was a very good friend of General James Wilkinson because he was in charge of all of the Spanish territory down in New Orleans, and he was a very good friend of Wilkinson. And of course, you've probably heard some of talk of the history of the Spanish conspiracy, which actually included Wilkinson and Burr, but we'll not go into that today. But I thought that was important to sort of let you know sort of the little bit of the history of the early days of Frankfort and who had most to do with the establishment of the city here.
Well, it's an awful small city to be a capital city. How did it become the capital city?
Well, that's another good question. In the early days, of course, Frankfort actually was part of Virginia. You know, they had a large county, which was called Kentucky County. And then in 1780, it was divided into 3 counties. You know, the whole state. It was called Kentucky County. But it was so large, they thought that the Virginia legislature, they passed an act. And it was, who do you think it was signed by? The act was signed by Thomas Jefferson. We were part of Virginia at that time. So they divided it up into Fayette County, Lincoln County, and Jefferson County. Now, North Frankfort and East Frankfort were in Fayette County, and South Frankfort was in Lincoln County. Bell Point West was in Jefferson County. It's very interesting to know that all 3 counties touch just below the railroad bridge. Isn't that interesting?
That is. It's fascinating that Kentucky was once a county rather than a state. Well, we're right here in front of the Love House, though.
Well, this is the Love House, and this house was built actually by General Wilkinson. Not this house, excuse me. This is the site of the house, which was a 2-story log building that he built here. And he never lived here, though, because his wife didn't want to live here in Frankfort, so he never lived in the house. And it was later sold to Andrew Holmes, who had a lot to do with Frankfort becoming the capital of Kentucky. And also it later was sold to a fellow by the name of Thomas Love, and it was known as the Love House. It was a tavern, an inn, and the exiled Prince Louis Philippe of France, he visited here. And of course Aaron Burr also visited here. You asked me a while ago how Frankfort became the capital of the state, and this is the way it happened. In 1791, George Washington, the President of the United States, he urged Congress to admit Kentucky into the Union, and Congress passed the act allowing us to come in. But Kentucky, we dilly-dallied around. We wanted actually to be the first state to enter the Union after the first 13 colonies, but Vermont beat us. So we actually entered as the 15th state of the Union on June the 1st, 1792.
So we're pretty close to an anniversary here.
Pretty close, that's right. In fact, a commission has already been established by the governor to look into the celebrations that we will have in 1992. But the first legislature actually met in Lexington on June the 4th, 1792. Of course, one of the first things they did, they elected Isaac Shelby as the governor, the first governor of Kentucky. You know what his salary was that first year?
Probably not a lot.
$1,000 a year. That's all.
Goodness.
And the legislators, we ought to tell this to the present legislators, the legislators at that time got $1 a day. And at the end of the session, if they were good maybe,
they voted correctly.
Yeah, they got $12 at the end of the session. But at that time also, there was a 5-man commission that was elected. It wasn't appointed. They had 20 people that were put up to be elected as commissioners to find out and select a capital of Kentucky. The 5 men were 2 men from Bourbon County, 1 from Fayette, 1 from Madison County, and 1 from Mason County. So they were to take bids from all of the different towns and sites that wanted to be the capital of Kentucky. And that was to have a whole lot to do. Whoever gave the best bid, the most money, the most land, and so forth and so on, was to get great consideration. So they visited quite a few of the places, and the places that were actually that put in bids to be the capital of Kentucky was, of course, Frankfort and Louisville and Lexington and Leestown, just down the road, Ledger Woods Bend and Delaney's Junction, and a little place in Woodford County named Petersburg. There was a fellow by the name of Andrew Holmes that handled the bid for Frankfort. He was real shrewd in including a lot of things that he felt like the other people that were going to bid, other towns that were going to bid, maybe wouldn't be able to supply. For instance, in his bid, he said that they would give 8 different lots right downtown, actually where the old Capitol is now. 8 lots, 30 more additional lots if they were needed. Also, all of the lumber, all of the sawmills that were necessary, 1,590 perches of stone, and also 10 boxes of window glass. You remember I told you about the Liberty Hall? They had to bring their window glass in from New York, and it actually might have come from Belgium, because Belgium was actually the country that made most of the window glass in the olden days. But also, not only the window glass, but they also included $140 worth of locks and hinges. Also, the thing that we always sort of felt like had a lot to do with it, nails were as scarce as hen's teeth in that time. And how he got a hold of these nails, we'll never know. But he included in his bid 15 kegs of nails. And we like to say, the nails did it.
I think so. I can't believe that. That may have turned the tables for Frankfort.
That's right. It had a lot to do with it. And of course, after we were established, they met again, and of course, after they made their report, this is sort of important too. In making the report to the legislature, this 5-man commission, there happened to be only 4 of them met. There was another one that was absent for some particular reason. And the one from, there were 2 of them that leaned towards Frankfort. One of them leaned towards Lexington, and another one, the fella from Fayette by the name of Robert Todd, he felt like that if he voted for Lexington, it wouldn't be exactly right since he was from Lexington. So he was the one that actually made the 3 votes, made the majority, even though he was from Lexington, he made the majority to establish Frankfort as the capital of Kentucky. Isn't that interesting, though?
I wonder what his people in Lexington thought about that.
They probably didn't like that too much. But you know, over the years, Louisville and Lexington always wanted to take it away from us. I think one of the reasons, of course, was that actually before 1859, 50% of the governors either were from Frankfort at the time that they were governor or immediately before or after. And 80% of the officials of the state were from Frankfort. So you can see there was a lot of jealousy involved. And as a matter of fact, it finally got so bad that in 1860, the Louisville Democrat published an article stating that Frankfort is downtrodden, it is ruined, it is no good, it needs to be taken away from. And as a result, the legislature appointed a committee to seek into the expediency of removing the capital from Frankfort. However, Lexington didn't want Louisville to have it, Louisville didn't want Lexington to have it, and as a result, even those 2 cities were sort of for taking it away, we have always been able to get help out in the state. As a matter of fact, the people of Frankfort are ready to fight on and scratch each other on almost any issue except capital removal. And they've always been a unit on that issue, and they've always been able to receive help from the rural counties out in the state to retain Frankfort as the capital of Kentucky.
Well, Frankfort seems like a good neutral location there between Louisville and Lexington.
Well, it is. It's centrally located, and I think we're over the hump, but we've had many a time, not just that one particular time, but many times there've been rumblings that they were going to take it to Lexington. As a matter of fact, you know, the courthouse in Louisville was built with the thought that that would be the capital of Kentucky at one time. That's right. That's true.
Counting your chickens before they hatch, isn't it?
That's right, Barbara.
Well, tell me about this corner.
Well, this is quite a famous old site. This is the site of the first legislature that met here in 1793 after Frankfort became the capital. Remember, I told you that Lexington, they had the first legislature over there. But this is the site of the first legislature that met here in Frankfort in 1793. Also, I might tell you that down the street here, there's a very interesting house. And that's the South Willis house, right next door. It was the home of Dr. John G. South, and he was a minister to Panama. It's interesting to know that he married a girl by the name of Christine Bradley, and she was the only daughter of former Governor Bradley. It so happens that William O. Bradley had a sister named Catherine Bradley, and she married E.P. Maurer, who later became governor of Kentucky. So the Maurers and the Bradleys and the Souths often met there in that house, and they were all Republicans. It so happened that when I was small, there was a boy, the Maurers had a son named Charlie Bob Maurer. Our backyards connect. See, my house runs that way, and theirs runs that way, so our backyards are right next to each other. So Charlie Bob would climb the fence and come over to my place, and we'd play basketball over there.
Well, isn't there a famous person who still lives over there down the street?
You mean this next house, that's the next house from the corner here that has the white pillars?
The little brick house.
Oh, well, I think it's a pretty important house.
Well, I hear that one of the greatest mayors Frankfort has ever known still lives there along with his wife.
Oh.
Mayor Frank Sower. Is that correct?
That's right.
You still live there. You try to keep that a secret, don't you? Let's move on down the street.
All right, let's go on down the next place.
Okay.
Now it's your...
Mayor Sower, we're at a very beautiful mansion on the corner of Wilkinson and Wapping Streets. Is there any history attached to this one?
Well, yes, there is a little history attached to it. It was built in 1914 by the fellow by the name of Graham Vreeland, and he was the editor and owner of the State Journal newspaper here. I think it's interesting maybe to note that I remember as a small boy, even 1914, I was still around, and I remember quite well while they were building this particular home, they had a huge sand pile down here. And I used to play in the sand pile, which was used for mixing the cement and the mortar together. And I used to play in the sand pile. I'd get it all over the place, you know. And the men would come and say, have to sweep it. What's that little kid doing there?
Run you off. They had no idea you were a future mayor, did they?
No.
No
didn't.
respect
That's
at all.
But Graham Vreeland had a wife, of course, and had two lovely daughters that I knew. One of them was named Annabelle, and the other one was named Margaret. I had an older sister, 9 years older than I, that was a good friend, and so my sister would come over here and play with the two daughters, and they'd come over to our house and play, and we enjoyed them very much. They were very nice people.
Well, there are actually people who still live here.
Yes, Dr. Martin lives here now with his wife, and they have two very fine children. I guess one of them is probably just about maybe as a senior in high school. I believe she goes to Sower in Lexington, and the other one is I believe she's still in college.
Well, let's go on down the street and see what we can find.
Come on.
Okay. Well, we're at this house now. This is the Bibb Burnley house. It's just right on down the street. Now, there's got to be a story behind the Bibb name.
Oh, yes. There certainly is. There was a fellow by the name of John Bibb that lived here many years ago, and he was an amateur horticulturist. Now, do you like Bibb lettuce?
I love Bibb lettuce, and he doesn't sound like much of an amateur to me after Bibb lettuce.
Well, I tell you, actually, I think that Bibb lettuce on sandwiches in the summer. Oh, when Mama fixes me a real nice sandwich with a little Bibb levy, it's so nice and soft and everything, it almost melts in your mouth. But John Bibb lived here. He had a brother named George Bibb that visited here quite often. He was a United States Senator from Kentucky. He was quite a distinguished man in his own right. Actually, this was the second house that was lived here on this street. You know, originally, remember I talked about this fellow Instone that named Wapping Street because he had lived by the Thames over in London, you know. Instone actually lived on this site originally. But also, after the Bibbs, why, we have the Crittendens that lived here, some of the descendants of John J. Crittenden, who was a United States Senator from Kentucky and Governor of Kentucky. And also there was a lady that's quite famous, and that's one reason they call it the Bibb Burnley House. There was a lady by the name of Patty Burnley that also lived here that was quite active in social and civic affairs here in Frankfort, and she was also a descendant of John J. Crittenden. So this house does have quite a lot of history in back of it. You probably were getting ready, I could see you were about ready to ask me, well, who lives here now?
Right.
There are two Bill Johnsons that are lawyers here in Frankfort. One we call Big Bill, that has his office up there at the Charles Moorhead House, you know, and Little Bill lives here, and he's another fine attorney and does a lot of, he does mostly deeds and looking up wills and estates and things like that. He has been associated with Leary, Joe Leary, the famous attorney here in Frankfort, for many years. So this again is another very fine house, and you can see the architecture is just a beauty to behold. And this again is one of the fine houses in this very historic area.
All within a block of each other.
Oh, within a block.
Let's keep walking and see what's on down the street.
All right. Okay.
Mayor Sower, just one door down the street is another historic site.
Yes, it is. It's a real fine house, as you can see. And it was built about 1854 and was the headquarters of the military governors of Kentucky during the Civil War. I've known quite a number of people that lived here in the past. They had a son, the Logans did, by the name of Tid Logan. And we were playmates when we were both very young. It doesn't have a whole lot of history behind it. It's a fine house. But I can tell you, Barbara, right across the street is one that we definitely don't want to miss. It has a lot of history behind it. Let's go over there.
Let's walk over here. Well, now we're at 404 Wapping Street, correct?
Right.
Tell me about this house.
Well, this has a lot of history to it, Barbara, in that this house is known as the Rodman Hewitt House, built in 1817. And it was the home of Admiral Hugh Rodman, who led one of the first expeditions up the Amazon River for the United States Navy. Also, it was the home of a fellow by the name of Fayette Hewitt, and he was a colonel, I believe it was, in the Civil War on the Confederate side. And I knew him quite well, and he was a fine old gentleman, used to tell a lot of stories about the Civil War. But what I wanted to tell you is that the Masons lived here when I was growing up, and Franklin Mason was about my age. And in the evenings, we would sit over here on the porch, and he had a grandfather that used to come down here, and he was an old Confederate soldier. His name was Chin, old Colonel Chin. And he would come down here, and he'd sit on this old front porch, and he would tell stories to Franklin Mason and myself all about the Civil War.
And that's the best way you find out history, is from people listening when you're a child.
That's right. And from his viewpoint, the Confederates never lost a battle.
Not a little prejudice, you think, huh?
It might have been a little bit. But we did hear a lot of very interesting stories from old Colonel Chin. And Franklin Mason was such a good friend of mine when we were growing up. He's gone now. But this is a very famous house. As you can see, it was built in 1817, and it's beautiful inside. And one of these days, I hope you'll have the opportunity to go inside this old famous house, okay?
I would love to. Let's continue on down the street.
I want you to go over here. I want to cross the street again, and I want to show you the Vest-Lindsey house that has a whole lot of history behind it.
Okay, let's go.
Okay.
Now we're at the Vest-Lindsey house, which is right down the street, across the street from the last house we were at. But can you tell me, there seems to be a lot of inspiration behind this house. A lot of different people have got inspirations for different types of subjects behind this house.
Yes, this is called the Vest-Lindsey house. Originally it was a fellow by the name of George Graham Vest. Quite a famous fellow, actually. He later became governor of Missouri, but he's best known for his tribute to a dog. You know, he defended a dog in court. And as I understand, he won the case. So he was a great dog lover. So he did do a great deal for the animal lovers of Frankfort, you might say. Also, another gentleman that lived here was Daniel W. Lindsey. And he was a Union general during the Civil War. You remember I just talked about the Confederates across the street?
So, and we've got Union soldiers at the Orlando Brown
That's
house,
right.
and now Union over here.
And up at the corner, we're going to talk about it, probably on our next trip, we're going to talk about the Crittenmans that had two sons. One was a major general on the Confederate side, and the other one was a major general on the Union side. So actually, Barbara, a lot of the families were split here in Frankfort, because Frankfort, or rather Kentucky, was a border state. I'll tell you a little bit more about that story when we get up to the John J. Crittenden house, which is only a block away. But I thought that the next time we meet and we continue our little tour, we're going to cross the street, we're going to talk about the Letcher House, which is now the home of the Women's Club of Frankfort, and across the street, of course, is the Thomas Todd house. Another Todd, you know, which is a famous house. And then on up the street, of course, we have the Methodist Church, we have the Macklin house, we have the John J. Crittenden house. We've got a lot to talk about on our next trip. I tell you, I certainly have enjoyed being with you this afternoon. The weather's been perfect.
I have too.
You look beautiful.
Thank
This
you,
has been
sir.
a perfect day for me.
Thank you. Me too, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Good.